We are back. Vintage sports talk from Nedick's at the Old Garden on 48th Street. Nedick's and the Garden are no longer here, but we are, and we go back on a weekly basis sharing our memories of the good old days of vintage sports, not just New York, but all over the place. And we have a panel of co-hosts that are here tonight. Alan Blumkin, our resident maven, is here. George Case III is here. And Hal Bock of the Associated Press is here. And we have a guest returning to the airwaves of Comfortably Zoned Radio, but for the first time on the Nedick's Vintage Sports Show, and he is Gary Sarnoff. Welcome back, Gary, and welcome here for the first time, Gary, at the same time. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me back. Very much appreciated.
Well, we're honored that you decided to come back. And I'm going to talk about what I was talking about off air a little bit. Originally, I thought we were going to talk strictly about your book on the Green Bay Packers. I want to find out all I can about Vince Lombardi. But George reminded me that you also wrote an excellent work on the 27 Yankees. So,
yes, I did. It was actually the First Yankee Dynasty. I pretty much covered the whole 1920s, the whole decade of the for the Yankees, but I put most of the emphasis on the late 1920s when they won 3 consecutive pennants and 2 World Series.
Okay, so we have much to talk about, and I'm going to try things a little bit differently today. We're going to go around. We're each going to ask you questions. I'm going to start first. I want to know something about Vince Lombardi that isn't common knowledge.
Okay, well, I'd have to say the first thing that comes to mind is his football career is a little bit, as a player, is a little bit over-fabricated. I mean, there's all this talk about he was all-city fullback and, how great he was at Fordham. And that's a little bit over-exaggerated. First of all, in high school, he wasn't all-conference, and he wasn't even a fullback. He was a halfback and played a little bit at guard. And the other thing, too, about, his football career at college, the 7 blocks of granite, he was hurt quite a bit. So he didn't play every game, although he had a lot of heart, and he was a good player on a good team. But, his playing days is a little bit over-fabricated.
Okay. Alan Blumkin.
Yeah, what I would like to know is that did he really react to the way they had to put? He said they had to put Paul Hornung on the New Orleans Saints expansion list. Was he really that upset by that, or is that just saying nice things? I know Jim Taylor was also sent to that team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was. He really didn't want to rid himself of Paul Hornung. He really liked Paul Hornung, but he only could protect so many players, and he figured Paul Hornung, with his neck injury suffered in 1965, hardly played in 1966. He figured the Saints weren't going to take him. I mean, he was pretty much damaged goods at the end of his career. So if you put Paul Hornung on the list, the guy that's damaged goods, chances are the Saints aren't going to take him. But lo and behold, the Saints did take him. And that was surprising to him because he really, Paul Hornung was his boy, and he really didn't want to part with Paul Hornung. That hurt him a lot.
And Jim Taylor was just a business decision at that point?
Yeah, Jim Taylor, he felt he deserved more money. He saw the 2 guys called the Gold Dust Twins because of the AFL and NFL wars going on before the merger came in when they used to bid on players. he saw the guys that were called the Gold Dust Twins, Donnie Anderson and Jim Grabowski.
Yeah.
They got lucrative contracts to sign with the Packers of the NFL rather than what they were being offered in the AFL. So, he saw what they were getting, and he was an established star. He had a lot of great seasons with the Packers, and he was around longer than they were, so he felt he paid his dues, and he felt he was entitled to more money, and the Saints were willing to give him more money, so he jumped ship. Super Bowl I was the last game he played as a Green Bay Packer.
Well, let's go to George Case, and it doesn't have to be the Packers. We could talk a little baseball. George Case III, son of George Case Jr., a star Major League Baseball player.
Well, thank you, Ralph. Gary and I have had many conversations about, Washington baseball, but the one thing I wanted to bring up, and I thought Gary could touch on a little bit, is a young man that I had the opportunity of meeting for the first time last year, who actually played for both the Washington Ball Club and the Green Bay Packers, and that was a ball player by the name of Tom Brown. So, Gary, you might want to talk a little bit about Tom, because it's a rather unusual career to double up as both a Major League Baseball player and a National Football League player. So if you'd like to talk about Tom for a few minutes,
Sure.
I think it'd be very interesting.
Sure thing. Tom Brown was a great athlete because not only did he play baseball and football in college at the University of Maryland, but his freshman year he was on the basketball team as well. So he was a three-sport athlete, which you'll never see today. But nevertheless, he had an option. He could play baseball or he could play football, and he tried baseball first. He gave baseball a shot, and after 2 seasons, he decided that he was more cut out for football. He wasn't a strong hitter with the Senators. Gil Hodges kind of thought that he thought Brown, one of the problems was he was indecisive about what career he wanted to pursue, baseball or football. But nevertheless, he decided on football after 2 seasons with the Senators, or in the Senators organization, and his timing was great. He signed up with Green Bay, and he was there right in time for 3 more championships and the first 2 Super Bowls as well. So his timing was perfect. And when he went to the Packers, Lombardi not only had a roster spot for him, but he had a starting position for him as well. He became the starting strong safety, moved ahead of the safety Doug Hart, and he was part of one of the best defensive backfields in the history of the NFL, with 2 Hall of Famers in Willie Wood and Herb Adderley. And
Herb Adderley was great, yes.
He sure was, as was Willie Wood. And the other good defensive back, very good starting defensive back, was Bob Jeter. The other cornerback was all pro 2 or 3 seasons. So he was certainly, and they had one of the best teams in NFL history, so he certainly was part of something special.
Well, I wanted to mention one thing, Ralph and Hal and Alan and Gary. This was a story that was told to me by my late Rutgers roommate, Pete Hall, and Pete and Tom Brown were roommates for a while at the York at the York White Roses Ball Club, and Pete was telling me that one day he's in the room and the phone rings, and Pete answers the phone. Tom Brown was not in the room at the time, and Pete said, "Tom's not here. Can I tell him who called?" And the voice on the other end, "Just tell Tom that Vince Lombardi called."
Wow.
So Pete told me that with a laugh. He said, "Can you imagine that?" He said, "I was talking on the phone with Vince Lombardi." So.
Right. Just having a piece of his time for a moment. Before we go to Hal, I just want to ask you, you mentioned Donnie Anderson and Jim Grabowski. Were they considered to be overall underachievers, given the money that they made, given that they forced those other two, Horning and the fullback out, whose name escapes me?
Jimmy Taylor.
Jimmy Taylor. Great. comparing him to, he was like Jimmy Brown blocking, who blocked. He wasn't quite as dynamic as Jimmy Brown, but he was a great blocker, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm. He was a very good blocker, and he was a hard runner. And, when he first came to the Packers, I mean, it was like, which was before Lombardi. He had arrived before Lombardi. And there was just a little bit of indecision on which position he should play. Should he play halfback or fullback? He wasn't quick enough to be a halfback, and he was a bit undersized to be a fullback. But Lombardi, he was set on making him a fullback, and of course he became one of the best fullbacks during his era, and is now in the Football Hall of Fame.
Okay, I interrupted you. Overall, were they overachievers, or was it the line deteriorated, and that led to the Packers' downfall? Actually,
well, they got old as a team. I mean, they were together for a long time, right from the time Lombardi arrived, and were still there after Lombardi left, and they got old as a team, and they got slower, and they just the team just simply wore out. They got old, and Phil Bankston was unfortunately was left holding the bag. He's the guy that succeeded Lombardi, but what are you going to do? I mean, you have to rebuild every once in a while.
Okay, Hal Bock, Associated Press.
Gary, I'm just curious about your thoughts about a story that broke today on the subject of brain damage in football players. There was a study that said of 100 ball players, 100 deceased NFL players, 99 of them showed signs of the CTE syndrome. And, I wonder, and this is really for the whole panel, I wonder what you guys think the effect of this will be on the NFL and on professional football.
Does it take it one step further from everything we've been hearing over the last 5 or 6 years, and the suits that have been filed? And is there anything really new about this study? I haven't seen it, but
well, it's 99 out of 100. That's 99% of the players tested, or of the brains tested.
Now, who were they testing? Were they testing players who showed obvious signs of brain damage only, or were they testing the gamut of players?
That I can't say. I haven't read the study. I just heard the report on the news tonight, and it startled me. And we've discussed this before, Ralph, about the future of football in America. And I just wonder what the prospects are when you have studies like this that come out, what the NFL can do to ameliorate this problem, or are we faced with, as we've talked before, about a dramatic change in what we know as football in America?
Well, knowing
this,
how can parents raise their kids to play the game? I think that's where the head start has to come. As in youth leagues, maybe develop helmets that are worth their weight.
What's interesting about this?
It's an open-ended question. There's no real definitive answer.
What's really interesting about this? Gary wrote about, and we've been discussing, what I consider to be the golden age of NFL football. The Packers, when they dominated and, of course, won the first 2 Super Bowls, you never heard of any of this problem. Now, was the hitting any less? I don't think so. But you never heard about any players with brain damage. Now you hear about it all the time.
Right.
Are we getting smarter? I don't know.
Well,
I'd like to just mention one thing that being that I was in the sporting goods and athletic footwear business, but I know there have always been a lot of studies that were being made for the helmet manufacturers, coming up with new padding, new designs, and that kind of thing, which is still going on. But I don't know what the outcome is going to be. But I do think personally, the size and the speed of the players today is just so much more dramatic than it had been in the earlier days. And if you look at just the equipment is pretty much the same now. Now Riddell and Adams, a few of the other football helmet manufacturers are coming up with a lot of different, new products. But I still think it's a huge problem that has to be resolved. But to me, the size and speed of the players today is part of the reason why you're having so many of these concussion problems. That's my personal opinion.
And just think, this is something though. Football will survive and continue to go on. If you look back at history of football, and I mean, it's always been a concern going back even as far as 1906 when there was a movement to abolish football, especially in college, because it was getting too rough. And that's when Teddy Roosevelt got involved. And, he was a sportsman. He wanted to see football go on. So he talked to the university administrators, sent out a message to the university administrators throughout the land saying, you guys better, do something to clean up your act, or else there won't be any more college football. And some of the things they did, of course, there was a number of rule changes, but the big thing was to cut the schedules from college football games. It used to be a 15 or 16 game schedule season. They cut it to 8 games. And of course, here we are now. They're adding on more games. We're now looking at with all these bowl games and now with the playoff, we're like back to 15 games again. But I think that's something they're going to have to consider is, better equipment, but I think they're going to have to consider cutting back games as well. And then a memory I have, going back to 1979, I remember Street and Smith magazine, NFL, talking about injuries in 1979, asking the question even back then, is football getting too rough? So this is something this is history repeating itself. They'll have to make some changes, I think, for sure, but football continue to go on.
But, Hal mentioned he was startled by 99%. And when you think about it, it is startling that higher percentage of players. And, I mean, I'm still astonished at that stat, and I don't know.
That is quite a stat. Well, it's like one of you guys just said, it's absolutely true that there is more hitting now, and these guys are bigger and they're faster. That's for sure. Something else too is is medical equipment and other aspects of technology. I mean, that's always improving, and it's always easier to diagnose. Or it's now easier to diagnose some of these happenings than it was 10 or 20 years ago. I think that's why you're hearing more about it as well.
Al Blumkin.
Yeah.
If you would talk to Mr. Sarnoff.
Have a learned opinion on it.
Pardon me?
It's tragic that this is happening, but it's just like in boxing. If you take too many hits in the head over a substantial number of years, it seems like this is going to occur.
Correct. That's absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Well, the tendency in the what I call the golden age of football was if you got hurt, rub it in the dirt and you got to get back in there, And there's none of that. That you don't see anymore. There is an attempt, at least I think there is, an attempt to address injuries, more traumatic injuries, but it just seems that they're multiplying. And I think what George said is quite true, and also Gary. the size and the speed of the game has multiplied, and that's a contributing factor. Now, how do you change that? I don't know. We can't make players smaller. You know, they're big and they're strong and they're fast and mobile, and I don't know how you make equipment any stronger. I don't know. George might have an opinion on that. But
well, you know what, Hal, let me just say this. The helmet manufacturers, equipment manufacturers have spent a lot of money over the years, and they come up with new designs. And I think the last couple of years, if you look closely at football helmets, I think you'll see a new design. But I still think that, they now have the concussion protocols and all the kind of things that they're doing to try to protect the players, once they get hit and they go through a whole litany of trying to ask them questions and do all kinds of stuff. And if they feel that they're not ready to go back in the game, then they don't. Where in the old days, they'd say, hey, I got my bell rung or I got dinged, and they go back in. But today, I think they're trying to do a lot better job. But, the equipment manufacturers are doing the best that they can, and the helmets have been improved dramatically over the past few years. But, the concussion and the head injuries and that is, to me, it's still a problem that has to be addressed at some point. And I know that a lot of youngsters, and I see it in the area in which I live, a lot of youngsters that played Pop Warner football or they played, the younger leagues in football, the kids are now playing soccer or they're playing lacrosse. And a lot of the parents don't want their youngsters to be playing football. So that's another problem. But
they're playing those sports bareheaded, George. They're playing those sports without any helmet.
Yeah, well, no, I know they are. But I think that, a lot of the parents, they're reading this stuff about concussions, too. And I know in my own instance, my grandson playing soccer, he had a concussion playing soccer. So, I mean, that's a problem, too, because the kids playing soccer, they're heading the ball and they're doing all that kind of stuff, and they don't wear a helmet. So, but I think the contact in football. Right.
I told my grandson who plays soccer, stay away from headers,
Right.
I know you're competitive and you want to win, but don't use your head.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you, Hal, very much.
And I know some people in some other
those
sports.
hitters are cumulative in damage.
Yeah.
So you may not be literally concussed from one hit, but over and over and over again, there's an incredible effect. So I will ask Gary. Gary says that football will continue, and Hal and I, over these weeks and months, have talked about the idea of football evolving to basically a flag football concept, where the athleticism of these guys can be displayed without the risk. Takes out line play completely, as far as I can see.
The average fan won't go for that.
They won't go for that. You think? Do you think it's because the paying customer still enjoys that good old Sam Huff?
Of course it does. It's like
violence.
It's like why the National Hockey League doesn't abolish fighting.
Well, fighting does it. You get your aggression out. They fight, and it's kind of fair, and they drop gloves, and I don't think it's. I don't think the fans like the fighting as much as fighting is good for the sport in letting out the aggression, because you talk about speed and hitting guys. How you address that, because you work for the Rangers. Address my concept there.
Well, yeah, and the Rangers, the years that I worked for the Rangers, they had a rough team, and they played a rough game, and they had fighters. They had Louis Fontanato, the great...
That's the guy who comes to mind. Didn't he fight Gordie Howe?
Yeah, he almost got killed. Gordie Howe almost ripped his ear off. But, you have to consider this also if you're talking about hockey, and this is an important aspect of it. These are guys skating around with sticks, and they use those sticks sometimes they'll use the sticks as weapons, and that's not a good thing either. I mean, I don't want to come across as an apologist for the sports, but I just think that, and I agree with Alan. I think fans would have trouble with this, but I just think you have to protect the athletes. You really do. These guys are human beings, and they have lives after football and after baseball and after hockey and so forth. And you want a quality of life, and you don't want them sitting in cars mumbling to themselves like the first scene in that movie Concussion. It's a scary aspect of sports, and it's something that troubles me. Now, I know Lombardi probably didn't worry about this, did he, Gary?
I think players are aware.
I doubt he did.
Did he?
He always worried about his players' health, as far as that they're maintaining their shape and past injuries and things like that. But as far as injuries, he expected his players to play with minor injuries. If they were well enough to play, he expected them to play. Regardless of an injury. That's what happened with Paul Hornung in 1965. His neck was hurting, but the Packers were making a run for the playoffs, and he told Paul Hornung he needed him, so Hornung did play. But Lombardi, though, he was a player himself. I talked a little bit about his career perhaps being over-exaggerated, but one thing about his playing career is that allowed him, he played with minor hurts and pains, and he knew from experience, what he could play with, and so he had a pretty good idea of what his players could or could not play with.
Gary, I want to ask you and Al the question: was Gehrig and Ruth allowed to dig in? Did anybody, like we grew up in the days of Bob Gibson and Drysdale and what have you, did they go challenged?
Did they go challenged?
In other words, did pitchers challenge them for the inside of the plate in those days?
That's actually a pretty good question. I think for like Babe Ruth, I think most pitchers were very careful pitching to him. They wanted to kind of nip the corners to try to keep the ball outside, try to nip the outside corner on him or get him to fish for a bad pitch. And probably the same with Gehrig. I think they were very careful as far as pitching to those guys because of their power. But as far as like going inside, though, that I'm not really 100% sure about.
Okay. Were there a lot of fight? Like you covered you wrote a book on the 27 Yankees. Were there fights? Were there rhubarbs in their history that stand out?
Oh yeah, for sure. With the Yankees, of course, the one I wrote about in my first book on the 1933 Washington Senators, the Wrecking Crew of 33. One of baseball's most celebrated fights occurred on April 25th, 1933, right here in Washington D.C. between the Senators and the Yankees. And I know that there were a number of other fights and a number of incidents involving Lou Gehrig, once meeting a pitcher under the stands, or with Babe Ruth going after a fan once in 1922 that was on his case, or another guy, Bob Musil, a less famous guy on those great Yankee teams. He had a much celebrated ball against the Tigers in 1924 after the pitcher hit him with a pitch. So yes, there were a lot of fights back then for sure. Always have been through the years in baseball.
Gary was.
So I take it when Gehrig and the pitcher mixed it up, it was probably over a close pitch, or.
Yeah, that was Earl Whitehill of the Detroit Tigers. It was 1926, and what had happened was Whitehill actually had plunked Gehrig the year before, and this was like their first meeting in 1926. And Gehrig made protests to an umpire who called a foul ball. Gehrig said the ball hit his wrist, and the pitcher then shouted, "Let's see that wrist." And Gehrig didn't like that, so Gehrig started heading to the mound. And when the umpire got between them, Gehrig said, "I'll see you after the game." And Earl Whitehill said, "Fine." And they met. Then there was a whole story. Exactly what happened next is kind of not known, but it turned out that Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth were involved after they met under the stands. What exactly happened is not known, but my point is, yeah, those things happened back then even.
Well, I wonder, you asked a question about whether Ruth and Gehrig were pitched inside. You have to remember that right around that time, I'm not sure of the year, it may have been 1920, Carl Mays hit Ray Chapman in the head, a Cleveland infielder, and killed him. And I wonder if pitchers might have been a little more careful after that episode, because that's quite a dramatic moment in baseball history.
Yeah, I mean, actually, for a time they were, because I remember one of the Yankees pitchers who pitched in the next game, Quinn, pitched in the next game, and he was really scared that something might happen. So I think for a time shortly after that tragedy, yes, pitchers were nervous about that happening again. And when it did happen, now luckily that was the only fatality, but when it did happen, usually pitchers were shaken up. The guy was accidentally hit in the head, and pitchers were usually shaken up and affected when that happened.
And don't forget there were no helmets in those days.
That's right.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that. We talked about football helmets and concussions and that kind of thing. When Gary and when he wrote his book and the whole era of the Murderers Row and the 20 Yankees and that era and the Philadelphia A's, and then when my dad was playing, ball players did not wear helmets. They had no protection. And the fact is that, the first protection that they had, they started to put some liners inside the helmets, and then they went to a helmet, and now the helmets have ear flaps and chin flaps and all kinds of stuff. But in an earlier era of baseball, and they're talking about when Carl Mays, the pitch that killed, the ball players had really no protection whatsoever. They just had to get out of the way, and that was the way they protected themselves.
Right.
Well, that reminds me of Gil McDougall hitting Herb Score.
Right.
Now, coaches wear helmets. First base and third base coaches have to wear helmets. But never was it ever thought of to put a helmet on a pitcher for protection.
And I had a question for George. I'm just wondering, because I'm just thinking about your dad played for the Washington Senators, and as you know, I know about the Washington Senators, and I look at that team from that era. Joe Judge, Bucky Harris, Buddy Meyer, Ossie Bluejay. They all got during their career at one point. They all took one in the head during their career. And I'm just wondering, did your dad during his career at any point did he ever take one in the head?
Not that I ever recall, Gary, but he might have, but I don't remember my father ever talking about that. But that the helmet and the lack of helmets and throwing at the head and all that kind of thing, as you know from that era, it cost Mickey Cochran his playing career. He was hit in the head and severely injured, and took up becoming a manager and just couldn't play anymore. And there have been histories of ball players. Jackie Hayes, who played with the White Sox, he was hit in the head quite a few times. Finally had to wear some sort of protective gear that was some of the first that was ever made. But that's always been a huge problem. And, players were always leery of that. I mean, there are two dangers if you're playing baseball. One, if you're hitting and you're going to, get thrown at and you have to try to protect your head. And the other area, which is what Ralph touched upon, was the comebacker with McDougall and Herb Score. And that's, if you're pitching, that's a scary proposition because you have no defense if that ball is hit right back at you.
That's right. And, you're talking about Jackie Hayes. I believe later in life he lost his eyesight.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
And another person
and
lost his hearing recently.
Other players, Tony Conigliaro, for instance.
Yes,
his career was cut short and ruined. There've been others.
Chance, Hall of Famer Frank Chance was another one who took so many knocks to the head that he eventually his hearing became really bad, and he died prematurely, and they thought that was due to being hit by too many pitches.
Yep.
And another guy they think that it happened to that. This is why his disease came about. They think because Lou Gehrig got hit in the head quite a few times. And they thought maybe his
that's been speculated on, and I don't think because they really don't know the causes of ALS, but that was certainly something I've read about that they do think that Lou might have had some sort of problem as a result of being beamed, and it just showed up all of a sudden almost overnight with the symptoms of ALS, but they attribute it possibly as an aftermath of being hit in the head.
Correct. That's right. I've read that.
Frank Gifford, the very famous hit that he took from Chuck Bednarik.
Right.
Yeah.
Where, it was a clean hit. Bednarik stood over him and pointed at him, but he wasn't gloating that he hurt him. He was gloating that he made the play, and Bednarik gets a bad rap for a clean hit. But it caused Gifford to retire for a whole year and not come back until
that happened in 1960. And Gifford sat out 61 and played his last two seasons since 1962 and 63 as a wide receiver or a slot back. He wasn't a rusher anymore.
Correct.
Right. Gifford was great, wasn't he, Hal Bock?
Yeah.
Terrific player. He came to the Giants. Came out of Los Angeles, out of USC, I think.
Yeah.
And he was a glamour boy. I mean, he was a handsome guy, and he was a star. And he had New York. I mean, he just took New York by storm. He was a major part of that Giants team that dominated New York sports for a period of time in the early '60s.
And even in the 50s too.
He originally came out as a defensive back. He
Yes,
played some defensive back in his first couple of years with the Giants.
I didn't know
Very
that.
versatile. Played a little quarterback for them. He was a reserve quarterback.
Yeah, he was. He was there when Lombardi. He was with the Giants before Lombardi came on board as the offensive coordinator.
Well, the Giants had Lombardi and Landry.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Lombardi went to
Jim Lee Howell led coaching staff. Lombardi
Giants
and
went up with Howie Sherman.
Is that something else? Wow. Alan.
Staff.
Yeah.
Alan, don't want to shortchange you. Anything you want to ask? Before I ask whether Leo DeRocher actually stole Babe Ruth's watch.
Now, all I want to say is that, what I tried to say before is that Carl Mays, a man named Mike Sowell wrote a book called The Pitch That Killed on that whole incident. And Carl Mays was a submariner.
Right.
And the Sun it happened late in the day because in those days they started a lot of games at 3 o'clock.
That's
so
right.
It was a combination of a submarine pitch and the Sun being in a position where Chapman's view of the ball was not very good.
Yeah, and one thing too was dirty baseballs. After that happened, they were more. Yeah, after that they were more consistent in
that
getting
was the
clean
first
baseballs.
year that they had the clean baseballs in the first year. They banned all the spitball and all the other trick pitches.
That's right. All the other trick pitches, right? With the grandfather clause for pitchers that were thrown at were still allowed to use it.
17 of them. And Broly Grimes was the last one who I think his last year was 1934. He was the last one of the 17 to retire. Now, of course, you had Gaylord Perry and Preacher Rowe and a few others.
And I'm sure there are pitchers that doctor the ball today, the fine art of getting away with it. I remember the story about Whitey Ford how he would use his wedding ring.
Yeah, and there was Joe Negro they caught with a nail file and somebody else with sandpaper.
Joe Negro.
Joe Negro was saying, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm shocked that this is going on today. I'm shocked. I can't believe that.
Yeah,
cheating in baseball going on today.
like court range in Casablanca, right?
Yeah.
What were you going to say, Alan?
No, that was like court range in Casablanca. You know, saying you're shocked that
out of the that's the line.
Oh yes,
Rick's Cafe. Yeah.
Yes. All right, gentlemen, this has been a pleasure. Very, very informative, Gary. Thank you for being here. I hope you will consent to return not only on this show, but all the other shows that we have going on the network. Keep coming back. You're terrific.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
All right. Very much. And, gentlemen, it's a pleasure. Hal Bock, Associated Press, Alan Blumkin, Maven at Large, and George Case III, who, George, we haven't for a while. Tell these people, because we only talk about it, we only seem to talk about it on the Washington show. Tell our audience on this show, who may not have heard it, the product that you put together, this DVD that you put together about the wartime baseball.
Well, yeah, thank you, Ralph. And Gary has been very kind to me. Has already purchased a couple of them, and it is a DVD. We call it Ball Field to Battlefield and Back, from FDR to JFK. It's all in color. It's 60 minutes in length, and it's 8mm color film. It was taken by my dad and Mickey Vernon, and both of them narrate the scenes that you see. So there's an awful lot of World War II era baseball and in color, and it's really a behind-the-scenes look. Players taking batting practice, riding trains, spring training, and all that kind of thing. So it is a look back at Major League Baseball a long time ago when it was a game. And matter of fact, the HBO series, when it was a game, used about 7 minutes of our DVD. So, I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, and our website might be of interest to, listeners to the podcast. It's called www.timelessbaseball.com. And again, it's all about World War II era Major League Baseball.
Beautiful. Now, Hal, tell us about the book that you currently have out. Actually, you have two books currently out, back to back. Book on the Cubs and Band. Anything new?
Gary wrote a book on the Yankees dynasty. I wrote a book on the Cubs dynasty. But my book goes back a little bit further, because the last Cubs dynasty was in the first decade of the 20th century. That book is called The Last Chicago Cubs Dynasty. And my current book is called Band, Baseball's Blacklist of All-Stars and others. And the Band book talks about ball players who have been suspended or banned for life from baseball for various indiscretions, fixing games, taking steroids, and so forth. Sometimes for
not
very
just
minor
players, but executives. George Steinbrenner is mentioned.
Oh yeah, I mean it goes. There's an umpire in that book, and there's a team doctor in that book. So that runs the whole gamut.
Tell me about the team doctor.
Team doctor was the doctor who worked for the New York Giants in 1908. And that was the year of the Fred Merkle affair, when Merkle failed to touch second base, and it forced a playoff game between the Cubs and the Giants.
That's a myth.
And before the game, down under the stands, the Giants team physician confronted Bill Clem, who was the best umpire in the history of baseball, and offered him money to see to it that the Giants won the game. And Clem was having none of that, and he reported the episode. And the Giants team physician was banned from baseball by the management. So there's all kinds of stories in my book, and it was a lot of fun researching and writing it.
Very interesting. Hey, guys, thank you. We will return. Alan, you tell them how we return.
Same bad time, same bad channel.
That's pretty good.
I'll be there.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Yep. Good night, everybody.
There,
Bye, everyone.
Keep on keeping on. That's what the name of the game is. One step ahead of each other, or whatever that expression is. But do keep on so you can come back and listen to us next week. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yep. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.